happened 15 years ago, just before my 16th birthday. My parents had gone all out to make the occasion special, organizing a family reunion in South Carolina. I hadn't been there since I was a little girl, and they thought it would be the perfect way to spend my summer vacation. More than that, it was a chance to reconnect with my cousins, Clara, Lila, and Zoe, who were all around my age. At first, I wasn't thrilled about the idea of a big family reunion, but the thought of spending time with my cousins swayed me. After all, it had been years since we'd seen each other, and I barely remembered them from my childhood. So I decided to embrace the adventure, and a few weeks later, we were boarding a flight to South Carolina. When we arrived at the hotel, my cousins greeted me with an enthusiasm that melted away any lingering doubts. Clara, the eldest at 16, was calm and composed. Lila, who was 15, had an adventurous streak, while Zoe, the youngest at 14, was brimming with confidence and mischief. We were like peas in a pod, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a bond that felt instantly unbreakable despite the years apart. The hotel was stunning, with spacious suites and luxurious amenities. Our parents decided to let the four of us share a suite, which was the ultimate setup for a girls' week. We squealed with delight as we explored the room, jumping on the beds and joking about being at a bachelorette party. The first day was a blur of laughter and fun. We spent hours by the pool, sunbathing and chatting with boys. Zoe, who had an uncanny ability to charm people, convinced a 24-year-old man that she was 19 and exchanged numbers with him. We laughed about it all night, staying up until 4 a.m., sharing secrets and planning more mischief. The next day, Zoe upped her game. She managed to get a pair of twins to buy us lunch, her boldness leaving us in stitches. That evening, after a family dinner at the hotel restaurant, we encountered two older men in the lobby. They were in their late 20s or early 30s, and they invited us to sit with them. I felt uneasy, but Zoe and Lila were eager, so we joined them. We played along with the charade, pretending to be in our 20s and sharing elaborate stories about being in town for a party. The men seemed to buy it, and though I couldn't shake my discomfort, I laughed along with my cousins. When Zoe suggested inviting them to our room, I put my foot down. "Zoe, no. Dad's room is right next door," I whispered. She rolled her eyes but eventually relented. Instead, we promised to meet them at the pool the next day. Back in our suite, we stayed up late, giddy with excitement and a little apprehension about what we were getting ourselves into. It was nearly 2 a.m. when we finally turned off the lights. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it, a faint metallic rattling. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then it came again, louder this time, the sound of the doorknob jiggling. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, sitting up. Zoe stirred. "Yeah, what is that?" The noise came again, and my heart started pounding. Lila, ever the brave one, got up and headed for the door. "Lila, don't!" I hissed, but she ignored me. She turned on the light and opened the door. "There's no one here," she said, stepping into the hallway. Then it happened. From the shadows, a man dressed in black with a white mask lunged at her. His gloved hand clamped over her mouth as he pulled her into the hallway. "Lila!" I screamed, leaping out of bed. Clara, Zoe, and I bolted after her. The man was dragging her toward a room at the end of the hall. Lila struggled fiercely, but he was too strong. Our screams must have been deafening because moments later, my dad and uncle burst out of their rooms. The man, startled, let go of Lila and took off running. My uncle chased him, tackling him briefly and landing a few punches before the attacker broke free and fled down the stairwell. Back in the hallway, Lila collapsed into our arms, sobbing and trembling. My dad and uncle returned, shaken, but relieved that she was safe. They called hotel security, who quickly contacted the police. Once back in the suite, we locked the door and huddled together on the bed, still shaking. The hotel staff assured us they were doing everything to secure the area, but by the time the police arrived, the man was long gone. The officers asked us a barrage of questions. Who had we been talking to? Had we noticed anyone following us? When they learned about our charade of pretending to be older, their expressions turned grim. "It's possible one of the men you met was watching you," one officer said. "He might have thought Lila was alone in the room." The thought made my stomach turn. Zoe's face paled as she remembered going back to the room alone earlier that day to change. Had someone followed her? Our parents were furious when they learned what we'd been up to. The police believed the attacker might not have been acting alone, and the possibility that he had planned to abduct one of us left us all terrified. The rest of the week was a nightmare. We didn't leave the suite except for meals, and even then we stuck close to our parents. When the police gave us clearance to leave, we took the earliest flight home. For months afterward, I jumped at every shadow and struggled to trust anyone. Therapy helped, but the memory of that night still haunts me. The man in the mask was never caught, and the unanswered questions linger like a dark cloud. What should have been a carefree summer turned into a nightmare, a chilling reminder that danger can hide in plain sight. It all started when I woke up to the sound of someone pounding on my apartment door. The sound was relentless, shaking me awake in a daze of confusion and fear. My heart was racing as I sat up in bed, my ears straining to make sense of the commotion. My mind jumped to the worst possibilities. Was it a break-in? A neighbor in trouble? I reached under my bed, fingers fumbling for the familiar, comforting feel of the baseball bat I kept there. Clutching the bat tightly, I crept toward the door, every creak of the floorboard beneath me sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my veins. When I reached the door, I did what anyone would do. I looked through the peephole. My vision was met by the sight of one of my neighbors. She was standing there, pale and trembling, her face swollen and streaked with blood. Her nightgown was soaked in crimson splatters, and there was an urgency in her expression that froze me in place. I hesitated, but before I could second-guess myself, I unlocked the door and swung it open. She stumbled in, slamming the door shut behind her. "You have to help me," she said, her voice trembling and barely above a whisper. "He's going to kill me." Her words sent an icy chill down my spine. I didn't need to ask who he was. She was talking about her boyfriend, a man I had never seen but now felt I knew all too well. Panic tightened its grip on me as she continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic stream. "If he finds me here, he'll kill you too. Please, we need to leave. Now." Without a second thought, I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter and ushered her toward the garage. Every step felt like an eternity as I imagined her boyfriend lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce. We jumped into my car, and I peeled out of the driveway, my tires screeching against the pavement as I sped into the night. As we drove, I tried to gather my thoughts. "Do you have anywhere safe to go?" I asked her, glancing at her bloodied form. She shook her head. Nowhere. I decided the best course of action was to get her to a motel and call the police from there. It felt like the safest, smartest thing to do. I pulled into the first motel I could find, a shabby, dimly lit place that felt like it had seen its fair share of desperate people. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw my neighbor, but I quickly explained that her boyfriend had attacked her and we needed to call the police. "She'll need some ice for her injuries," the receptionist said. I nodded and went to fetch some, but by the time I returned, my neighbor had already called the police, or so she claimed. Relieved, I sat beside her as she pressed a bag of ice against her swollen face. She burst into tears, and it broke my heart. I did my best to comfort her, telling her she was safe now and that help was on the way. But as the minutes ticked by, a nagging unease began to creep in. The police never arrived. I suggested we call them again, but my neighbor dismissed the idea. "Don't worry," she said. "They'll be here soon." Her vague responses unsettled me, but I pushed the thought aside. What else could I do? Then, as I studied her more closely, I realized something strange. There was far too much blood for the injuries she'd shown me. Her lip was swollen, and she had a small cut above her eye, but nothing that would explain the crimson stain soaking her clothes. "Are you sure you're not hurt anywhere else?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No," she said sharply, her tone defensive. The tension in the room thickened. Something wasn't adding up, and my instincts screamed at me to get out. I pulled out my phone, intending to call the police myself, but as I dialed, she whipped out a knife from nowhere. "Put it down," she ordered, her voice low and menacing. My blood ran cold. This wasn't fear anymore. It was pure terror. The realization hit me like a freight train. She wasn't the victim. She was the threat. She demanded I drive her to the Canadian border, her eyes wild and unblinking. The knife glinted in her hand, and I knew one wrong move could be my last. My mind raced, desperate for a way out. "I'll take you," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "But we should grab some food first. We'll need energy for the drive." She hesitated but eventually agreed, warning me not to try anything. I suggested we order delivery to avoid drawing attention, and when I placed the order, I included a desperate note for the driver. "Call the police. Room 12. Knife." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we waited. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to stay calm. When there was a knock at the door, she moved to answer it, the knife still clutched in her hand. The moment she opened the door, the police were on her. They moved with lightning speed, guns drawn and a taser ready. She barely had time to react before she was on the ground, the knife clattering out of her grasp. It wasn't until later that I learned the full story. The boyfriend she'd claimed had attacked her? He was the real victim. She had stabbed him repeatedly during a fight, leaving him barely alive. He had crawled to a neighbor's apartment to call for help, which led the police straight to her trail. I sat in stunned silence as the officers explained everything. My hallway was now a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, and my apartment door was streaked with blood from when she had banged on it. Even now I can't shake the feeling of how easily I had been deceived. One false move, one moment of hesitation, and I might not have lived to tell this story. Sometimes I still hear the knock on my door in my nightmares, and every time, my heart races as I wonder what if. It was the summer I turned 8, and my twin sister Amy and I were on a family vacation to California with our mom. We stayed in a cozy little hostel near the beach, a quiet place surrounded by lush palm trees and the smell of salt in the air. The sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and everything felt peaceful. Until one morning, it all changed. That morning, Amy and I had just finished brushing our long, dark hair and were heading out for a walk with our mom. We always dressed alike, matching dresses, shoes, the whole thing, something our mom thought was cute. But it also meant that people would stare at us a lot, fascinated by the twin thing. It wasn't unusual to catch people's glances, and we were used to it. But that day, something felt different. As we walked down the narrow hallway of the hostel, we passed a man who was standing near the end, just watching us. He was stocky, with dark skin and a scruffy beard, dressed in traditional Middle Eastern garb. His eyes were fixed on us with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't look away when we walked past, and there was something in the way he stared that unsettled me. Amy must have felt it too, because she shot me a glance and immediately grabbed my hand. But our mom, oblivious to our discomfort, simply smiled and greeted him as she always did when we passed strangers. We didn't say anything at that moment, but the moment the man's gaze lingered too long, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. We quickly brushed it off, heading out to a nearby supermarket to grab some snacks, but the feeling of being watched never left. Inside the store, Amy and I were picking out cereal when I felt the familiar shiver down my spine, the unmistakable sensation that someone was staring at me. I turned around slowly, And sure enough, there he was. The man from the hostel, his dark eyes locked onto mine from the end of the aisle. I nudged Amy and nodded in his direction, trying to be discreet. She looked up and her face drained of color. We exchanged worried glances, both of us wondering why he was following us. This time he wasn't pretending to be casual. As we turned to leave the aisle, he appeared right behind us, pushing his cart. But instead of continuing on like anyone else would have, he stopped dead in his tracks and began eyeing a fruit display, as if he'd forgotten what he was doing, and was suddenly obsessed with the oranges. It was strange, so strange, that we couldn't look away. Mom didn't seem to notice anything unusual. She was busy browsing the aisles for things she wanted to buy, humming to herself, unaware of the unsettling scene unfolding behind her. But Amy and I couldn't stop watching him. Every time we turned a corner, there he was, staring at us from a distance. His breathing seemed off, ragged, heavy, like he was struggling to catch his breath. And his cart? It was almost empty, except for a few loaves of bread. Finally, we couldn't take it anymore. We told our mom, but she just rolled her eyes. "You two are imagining things. We've seen him everywhere, just like everyone else." "Stop worrying," she said dismissively, continuing to browse the shelves. But the man's presence lingered, even as we moved through the store. Amy and I began to feel a panic building inside us, like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare we couldn't wake up from. Then, just as we were about to check out, everything escalated. Amy asked our mom for a chocolate bar, but our mom, irritated by the constant demands, snapped back that there wasn't enough money for such things. That's when we heard the man's voice. Too close. Too sudden. We turned around, and there he was, standing less than a foot behind us, his breath smelling of sweat and anxiety. His eyes were wide, almost manic, and his lips twisted into a grotesque grin. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice trembling with nervous energy. "I didn't mean to scare these beautiful girls. Are they your daughters?" Mom froze, her expression immediately shifting from irritation to wariness. But before she could respond, the man kept talking, his words coming out faster now, almost in a blur. I couldn't help but notice. "You don't seem to have enough money for what they want," he said, his eyes darting to the chocolate bars and then back to my sister and me. "How old are they? How old are you? I can help. I have plenty of money. I can give you whatever you need. All you have to do is tell me how much." My mom's face twisted with confusion and anger, but the man didn't stop. "How much do you want for the girls?" he asked, his voice lowering to a sickening whisper. "I'd love to keep them, or even you if you like. But if you want, I'll just take one. Name your price and it's yours. I can make it work. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you." I could feel the blood drain from my face. Amy was clutching my hand so tightly I thought it might break, but our mom, her face now a mix of horror and fury, didn't answer him. Instead, she stood there, staring at him, and then suddenly snapped, "Behind me. Now." We didn't hesitate. We obeyed, instinctively falling behind her as she stepped in front of us, shielding us from his gaze. I could feel her body tense with a kind of cold fury I'd never seen before. The cashier, a teenager who looked like he was barely 18, was staring at us with wide, terrified eyes. He didn't say a word, but I could see his hands shaking as he scanned the groceries. My mom turned to the man, her voice now low and dangerously calm. "If you ever come near my daughters again, I'll gouge your eyes out through your nose and shove them down your throat. Do you understand me?" The man's grin faltered, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the seriousness of the situation. Without another word, he turned and walked away, but he didn't leave. We watched in horror as he pressed his face against the glass of the store's front window, his sweaty palm leaving streaks as he tried to peer inside, his eyes still focused on us. It was like something straight out of a horror movie. Mom didn't waste another second. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911, and quickly explained the situation. As we waited, the man finally peeled himself off the window and walked out of the store. But we stayed inside, frozen in fear. When the police arrived, they moved fast. They grabbed the man from behind the hostel and placed him under arrest. The officers were calm, efficient, taking our statements and questioning the witnesses, but my mom was trembling, her grip tight on our hands. We learned later that the man had been stalking girls in the area for weeks, attempting to buy them from their families. His intentions were too horrifying to fully grasp at the time. By that afternoon, we were packing up and leaving for home. Mom decided to cut our trip short. We never knew what happened to the man after that, but I've never forgotten the way his eyes looked at us, and I pray that no one else ever has to face him. My family's life was far from ordinary. We moved constantly, sometimes once a year, sometimes several times within a year. My stepfather had a serious alcohol problem, and my mother was struggling with her own issues, prescription drugs and whatever else she could get her hands on. This story took place when I was between 9 and 10 years old, after we'd moved from Tampa to Winslow, Arizona. We didn't understand why we moved so often, but I hated it. I hated never being able to settle down, never getting the chance to make friends, and always leaving just when I started to feel somewhat comfortable. This particular time, we moved to Arizona to visit my mom's stepfather, and we ended up staying there for a few months. Eventually we left because the violence in that area was too much to bear. We were a family of 6, but we spent most of our time in cheap motels, bouncing from room to room like we were just drifting through life. My parents had a strict rule. My 3 brothers and I were not allowed to stay in the room during the day, no matter how hot it got outside. Arizona summers were brutal, temperatures well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit most days, but we had no choice. We were pushed out into the parking lot or told to find some other way to entertain ourselves. The only relief was finding a soda machine that wasn't locked, or maybe if we were lucky, finding another kid to play with. One of the kids I met was named Daisy. She was about my age and had been at the motel a little longer than I had. Daisy was kind of annoying, but she was company, and I appreciated it. She'd been stuck in that motel with her dad for weeks, just like me. On most days, I'd knock on their door and ask her dad if she could come out and play. But one afternoon, it was just me. My brothers had gone out with my stepdad, and I was left alone. The sun was burning down on me as I wandered across the cracked parking lot, feeling the heat radiating up through my sandals. I was bored, and after a while of roaming aimlessly, I decided to go find Daisy and see if she could come outside to play. I walked over to the room where Daisy and her father were staying, and as I neared the window, I noticed something strange. The curtains were moving, just slightly, as if someone was watching me. My stomach flipped, and I stopped in my tracks. I glanced around, half expecting Daisy to pop her head out from the door, but no one came. I hesitated, my heart starting to race. I called out her name, Daisy? But the door stayed shut. Then, after a few tense moments, the door creaked open. But it wasn't Daisy who stepped out. It was a woman. She was tall and thin, her faded red hair tangled and wild, falling in messy clumps around her face. Her eyes were an unsettling shade of blue, too deep, too knowing, like she could see right through me. She moved toward me with a kind of unnerving calmness, and my body froze in place. I tried to back away, but before I could react, she reached out and grabbed me by the waist. Her grip was strong, unyielding. I felt the panic hit me all at once, the kind of terror that seizes you when you know something's terribly wrong but you can't escape it. She smiled at me, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, almost haunting, like she knew something I didn't. "I know you," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I know who you are. You are a star. I know your destiny. You are a star, the destined child. I can show you." Her words were nonsensical, but they felt too real. There was no way she could know me, who I was, or who my family was. But the way she said it, her eyes boring into mine, made me feel like there was something more to it. I felt sick. Before I could scream or try to break free, she began to pull me toward her room. My feet dragged against the hot concrete as I tried to struggle, but her grip on me was unrelenting. I screamed, hoping someone would hear me, but she just pulled me harder toward the door. In my panic, I realized that I was no longer thinking straight. I was too frightened to even process what was happening. I just knew I needed to escape. But the woman kept whispering those same words to me, over and over, like a chant. And then, just as we reached the door, she tripped. I didn't think. I didn't even hesitate. The moment her grip loosened, I tore myself free and hit the ground, scrambling to stand up. But before I could fully get away, she recovered quickly, grabbing my ankle with frightening strength. I gasped in terror as I fell, face first into the dirt. Her hands were on me, pulling me back toward her, her nails digging into my skin like claws. My heart was pounding in my ears, and all I could think about was how far away my family was, how they couldn't help me. I screamed again, calling for my mom. I begged, pleaded for the woman to let me go. But she didn't listen. She just kept pulling me further toward her room, her footsteps dragging me through the parking lot. I thought I was going to die. The despair washed over me like a tidal wave. I felt completely hopeless, like there was no way out. But then, I heard a man's voice. "Hey, what are you doing?" The woman's grip loosened, and in that split second, I kicked her hard. She staggered back, and I scrambled to my feet, barely able to breathe. I was trembling, my body stiff with fear. Daisy's dad came running out of the room, his face a mask of concern and confusion. He rushed to my side, asking if I was okay, trying to comfort me, but I was too shaken to listen. "I'm fine," I whispered, not sure what was happening, not sure if I could trust anyone anymore. He urged me to stay quiet about what had happened, begging me not to tell anyone. But I was too terrified to speak. The woman, now standing in the doorway, looked at me with those wide, empty eyes as if she knew I would betray her. I ran back to my room, heart pounding in my chest, and found my mom sitting in front of the TV. I was shaking so much that I could barely speak, but when I finally told her what had happened, her face went pale. She stood up immediately, storming out of the room without another word. I watched through the window as my mom confronted Daisy's dad. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw him pushing the woman back into the room. Shortly after, the police arrived. I looked out the window, and there she was, banging her fists against the patrol car window, her eyes still locked on mine. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She was screaming at me, her words drowned by the glass between us. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Who was she? Why did she know my name, my destiny, as if we were connected somehow? But all I knew was that I was never going to forget her face, that twisted smile, the way she held me, and the way she knew me, like she had been waiting for that moment my whole life. It was about 14 years ago, and I was 20 years old, feeling like I had finally crossed over into adulthood. My cousin, who lived in Alabama, had offered me a job at his uncle's glass shop. Nothing glamorous, just a gig installing windows in tall buildings. Still, it sounded like an adventure. I had just moved from Tampa to Jacksonville, Florida, and I'd been itching to go visit him and stay with him for a while. This would be my first long road trip, my first time away from my family. I was driving an old Ford Taurus, barely holding together. It was the kind of car that sounded like it might fall apart with every bump, but I was young, indestructible, and naive. I didn't think anything could go wrong on a simple interstate highway drive. My parents, though, were the cautious type. They packed me a bag with food, water, and an emergency kit, but I brushed it off. After all, it wasn't like I was driving through some desolate wilderness. Gas stations were everywhere. I had my cell phone. What could possibly go wrong? The road trip started off fine. I was excited to see new places, but somewhere along the way, things took a strange turn. Alabama's cold hit me like a punch to the gut. I had no idea it could get so cold up there, especially since I was used to Florida's heat. On top of that, the heater in my car didn't work, but I figured it was no big deal. Just a few more hours, and I'd be there. The problem started when my GPS began directing me off the main roads, onto narrow, winding gravel paths. The further I drove, the more my surroundings changed, and a sinking feeling began to form in the pit of my stomach. The roads started losing names, replaced by numbers I didn't recognize. This wasn't the kind of place I was used to navigating. By now, the cold was unbearable, and my stomach had started growling in that way only hunger can. I realized too late that my parents' advice to pack food wasn't just paranoid. They were right. I was hungry and frustrated, and it didn't help that the GPS was now useless. The printed MapQuest directions I had were quickly becoming irrelevant, and I was lost, without a clue of where I was or how to get back on track. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw a small, run-down grocery store. It sat beside an old motel that looked like it hadn't been in business for decades. There was a faint light flickering inside the store, and I thought, maybe this is my chance to grab something to eat. I pulled into the parking lot, feeling a little relieved. The store had no name, just a worn sign that simply read, "Grocery Store." The building seemed ancient, like it had been stuck in time. Still, the light shining through the windows made me think it was open, so I got out of my car and walked toward the door, eager for a snack. The moment I stepped inside, something felt off. It was dim. Most of the interior lights were out, casting long, eerie shadows in the aisles. The air smelled faintly rancid, but hunger overcame my hesitation. As I moved deeper into the store, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, just a flicker of motion, like someone or something was hiding in the back. "Hello?" I called out, my voice uncertain. No response. "Hello? I came to check if you're still open," I said a little louder. Still, nothing. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just an old, quiet store, and maybe the owner was closing up. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I walked further in. Then, from the back, I heard a voice. "Oh, I'm sorry. We were just about to close. How can I help you?" The man who appeared caught me off guard. He wasn't old, like I had expected. He was in his 30s, wearing a faded, worn-out shirt. He smiled, and it was almost too wide. It didn't feel like a friendly smile, though. It was more like something rehearsed. His eyes didn't match his grin, and it was as if he was scanning me. The whole interaction felt off. I told him I was hungry, that I was driving from Florida and had been on the road too long. "We have lots of stuff," he said, his voice too bright, too eager. "What do you want?" I felt a weird discomfort creep up my spine as he spoke. His smile stretched unnaturally, his eyes still fixed on me, unmoving. The man's lips twitched as if he was savoring something, but nothing in his expression changed. He was too still, too focused on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't being honest. "Do you have Doritos?" I asked, trying to keep it casual, just wanting to grab something and leave. "Oh yeah, I have those." "Follow me," he said, his voice light, almost too casual. Against my better judgment, I followed him. As we made our way to the back of the store, the strange feeling only intensified. The plastic curtains separating the back storage area from the rest of the store flapped lightly as he pulled them aside, revealing a dimly lit room. The air smelled even worse back here, sour, rotten. "This way," he said, his voice almost a whisper, too low for comfort. My instincts were screaming at me now. Something wasn't right. I hesitated. Is this safe?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly as I backed away a bit. The man didn't respond directly, but his eyes darted around the room, as if checking for anyone else in the store. "We have all the good stuff back here," he said, winking. I glanced at the shelves. Something caught my eye. A stack of bags on a low shelf, but they didn't look like any regular bags of snacks. They looked wrong, puffy and swollen. As I looked closer, I realized they were bags of meat, not anything I wanted to eat. And they didn't smell fresh. A cold shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't normal. I grabbed a bag of chips from the shelf, my hands shaking. "I think I'm good. I'll take these," I muttered, not caring anymore. But the man wasn't finished. He blocked my way and gestured to the back room. No, I have something much better back here," he insisted, his voice turning slightly harsher. That was it. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in. I backed away slowly, pretending to check my pockets as I stammered, "Wait, I think I forgot my wallet in the car. I'll be right back." Without waiting for him to reply, I turned and bolted for the door. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands clammy, before finally hearing the satisfying click of the lock as I pushed it open and rushed outside. I didn't look back. I jumped into my car, my legs shaking uncontrollably, and sped off. I didn't stop until I reached my cousin's house. I didn't even think about it until later, but I'd managed to hold on to that bag of chips. I guess in my panic, it was the only thing I could focus on grabbing. It wasn't until I was safely inside my cousin's house, feeling the weight of the night's events, that I realized how close I had come to something much worse. That man, he was up to something. Something twisted, and I had no idea what. All I knew was that it wasn't just a grocery store. That night I didn't sleep much, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had narrowly escaped. But I never forgot that place, and I don't think I ever will. I'm 22 years old, and I'm still a virgin. It frustrates me at times, and I think it's part of why I've had such a hard time getting comfortable with myself when it comes to relationships. A couple of months ago, I decided that it was time to change that, so I took a leap and contacted an escort. Prostitution is legal in my country, so I figured I wasn't doing anything wrong. After some browsing, I found a profile of a blonde Russian girl in her 20s. She looked pretty, and I thought, why not? I set up a meeting for a couple of days later. The day of the meeting arrived. I was nervous, but I figured I could handle it. I took a break from work and drove to the nearest big city, which was about a 2-hour train ride away. I live in a small college town, and options there are pretty limited. I'd never been to this city before, so I felt a bit out of place. The excitement of actually taking the plunge felt mixed with some anxiety. The girl told me she would send me the exact address just a couple of hours before our meeting, which I didn't fully understand at the time. I figured it was just part of the process, so I waited, phone in hand, checking my battery nervously. About an hour before we were supposed to meet, my phone started dying, and I panicked. I sent her a message, desperate to know if she was still going to meet me, but I didn't get a reply right away. I restarted my phone every few minutes, hoping the text would come through. Eventually, she sent me the address. It was a relief to know I was close, only a 10-minute walk from the train station, but I still had no idea what to expect. I walked down the street, checking Google Maps at every turn. The city was much larger than I had anticipated, and the unfamiliarity made me uneasy. After about 10 minutes, I arrived at a dead end. The address led me to an alley behind an apartment building. My heart rate increased. It was quiet, too quiet. It felt like I was walking into some kind of trap, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I still had 40 minutes to kill before our date, so I decided to walk around the area, trying to calm my nerves. Looking back, I must have seemed like a lunatic, pacing in circles like a character out of some cheesy horror movie. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Finally, I texted her again, and she instructed me to go to a motel at the end of the alley. She assured me that the room was included in the price of her services, which relieved me a little. At least I wouldn't have to pay for a room on top of everything else. The motel looked odd, old, run down and out of place in the otherwise normal street. I hesitated before approaching the door, but eventually, I walked in. The air in the lobby was thick with the smell of mildew, and the lighting was dim. It didn't feel welcoming, not at all. I approached the counter and spoke with the woman behind it. She looked strange, nervous, like she hadn't slept in days. She was thin, almost skeletal, with dark circles under her eyes. Her behavior only made me more uneasy. Before I could leave, though, something unexpected happened. The man I had seen earlier, one of the staff members I assumed, came back with a much younger-looking girl, guiding her to a room. For a second, I thought they might be related, but there was something off about the situation. It felt wrong. The woman behind the counter told me all the rooms were occupied, but I was about to leave when, out of nowhere, I got a text from the girl I was supposed to meet. It was simple. Second floor. Knock on the door. I felt a bit of relief at having clear instructions, but at the same time, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The place was completely silent, and the hallway seemed strangely devoid of activity. I climbed the stairs, slowly, every step making me more anxious. The walls were painted with bright, almost garish colors that seemed mismatched, creating an unsettling atmosphere. It was as if the place was stuck in time, the colors screaming out in contrast to the dead quiet around me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I knocked on the door. It felt like I waited an eternity before hearing any sound from the other side. Shuffling, something like preparations. Finally, the door opened, but instead of the young, attractive Russian girl I had seen in the photos, an older woman appeared. She couldn't have been younger than 50. Her skin was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Before I could even process what was happening, the door shut behind me with a soft click. My gut twisted with fear. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how. This was all wrong. The woman's smile was strange, almost vacant, like she didn't really understand what was going on. She tried to usher me inside, her words slurred and unclear. Something wasn't right. I didn't even have to think about it. I had to leave. I tried to think of an excuse, something, anything to get out of there. I just need to step outside for a second, I said, my voice shaking. I'll be right back. I gestured towards the door and moved quickly toward it. As I opened it, I could feel her watching me, but I didn't stop. I ran down the stairs, my legs trembling beneath me, heart pounding in my chest. But just as I reached the bottom, the guy from before, the one who had led the girl to the room, appeared in the hallway behind me. "Did you find your date?" he asked, his voice casual. But there was something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Without a word, I grabbed the door handle and bolted. I didn't care about politeness or embarrassment. I just wanted out. My mind raced as I ran down the alley and into the street. I sent the girl a quick message, trying to explain that I had made a mistake, that I wasn't going through with it. I braced myself for some angry reply, some threat about the money, about what would happen if I didn't pay. But to my surprise, I got nothing. No response. I stood there, my heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. Was it a scam? Or had I almost stepped into something far darker? I couldn't tell, but all I knew was that I had escaped something, and I had no intention of ever going back. Looking back, I still don't know what exactly I walked into that night. But I've learned my lesson. If you're thinking of paying for adult services, make sure you're dealing with a reputable service. Stay away from shady motels, and make sure you're not walking into something dangerous. You never know what kind of nightmare might be waiting for you. That night, after everything that had happened at the motel, I finally decided to step out of my room. I had been planning to leave early in the morning to get back on the road, but something about the place made me feel like I had to go out for a moment before bed. The heavy air from the day still hung thick outside, and as I walked toward the door, a gust of wind hit me directly in the face. Immediately, something about the atmosphere felt wrong. The air had a dry, suffocating quality to it, and the discomfort settled deep in my throat like a lump I couldn't swallow down. I paused for a second, trying to shake it off. A few soft thumps to my chest, a cough that felt too harsh in my throat, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. But as I reached for the door, memories of what the motel owner had said about the lock swirled through my mind. The lock was a bit tricky, but with some concentration, I managed to get it free. I pulled the key out, but then a strange thing happened. There was another jangle of keys, coming from the next room. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and my eyes shot to the neighboring door. I waited, tense, watching as the lock clicked open. The voice that followed was low and filled with frustration. "What the hell is wrong with these doors?" I quickly looked away, trying to act casual, like I hadn't been listening. My heart was pounding, and I started to feel like I was losing control. I thought about leaving the motel altogether, maybe heading over to the coffee shop I had seen across the street to calm my nerves. The neon light from the small shop shone like a beacon in the distance, so I decided to walk over and grab something to soothe my throat. As I walked away from the motel, I heard footsteps behind me. "Hey lady, wait up," a voice called. I turned around, expecting it to be another guest, maybe someone who had a question or wanted to chat. But as he approached, the air seemed to change, colder, heavier, like something had shifted in the universe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I looked up at the man who had called me, and the knot in my stomach tightened. He was tall, dark-skinned, with a long mane of hair falling over his shoulders. He was athletic, broad-shouldered, and had this presence that demanded attention. And I hated it. I didn't know why, but I felt completely small in his presence. I smiled weakly, trying to be polite, but my heart was racing now. The weirdest part was, even though he hadn't done anything wrong, I was more uncomfortable than I had ever been around anyone. He stepped closer, and that's when I smelled it. It was subtle at first, just an odd scent, but as he got closer, it hit me. It was something foul, like sweat mixed with something rotting. I wanted to turn away, but I didn't. I thought I'd be rude, and I didn't want to offend him, so I mentally pushed the idea away. But the smell kept growing stronger, and I couldn't stop myself from turning slightly, creating some distance between us. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice turning colder. But it was the look on his face that made my heart stop. His eyes were locked onto me, dark and unreadable, sizing me up in a way that made my skin crawl. It was as if he was measuring me for something I didn't understand. "Do I know you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I tried to back away. "No," he said, his expression darkening. "But you saw me, and now I have to kill you." The words felt like ice water. Time slowed, and for a split second I couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body went rigid, and the world around me blurred. My first thought was to run, but before I could react, I saw him reach for something at his belt. A knife, a long, dirty knife, the blade stained a rusty red. I gasped in shock, feeling the adrenaline spike through me like electricity. My stomach dropped, and panic flooded my veins. My knees wobbled, but somehow I was still standing. I could feel an invisible weight pressing down on me, pushing me toward him, as though the very air around me had thickened, making it harder to breathe. My body screamed for me to run, but I was frozen. Then, in an instinctive burst, I turned and bolted. I ran, my legs burning, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. The cold night air hit my face, but it only seemed to make everything worse, like the atmosphere was suffocating me. I heard him behind me, his heavy steps matching mine, and his voice broke through the night air. "I'll cut your throat. Expletive. You've seen it all. Don't try to fool me." His words were like poison in my ears, but it didn't matter. I couldn't stop. I was running, crying, my tears mixing with the wind, falling before they could even touch my face. "Help! Please help!" I screamed, but my voice was a mere whisper against the wind, lost in the cold night. I could feel him getting closer, closer. His hot breath was right on my neck. Please, I thought. Please help me. I don't want to die like this. The words made him angry. His pace quickened, and just as I screamed again, I felt a sharp pain in my back, a searing, hot pain that almost made me collapse. I doubled over, falling to the ground. When I looked up, he was standing above me, the knife raised high, dripping with blood. "All women deserve to die," he hissed, his face twisted with hatred. The words barely made sense, and I could feel my body going numb from the pain. The blade was coming down, and in that moment, everything felt like it was slowing down. My vision blurred, and I could feel my life draining away. I screamed again, desperate, terrified, my last cry for help. And then, it happened. A single gunshot rang through the night, echoing in the silence, so loud it felt like the whole world had exploded. The man jerked back, his chest heaving, and he looked down in disbelief. He grabbed at his chest, stumbling backward as his knees buckled. "Damn it!" he screamed, but the words were choked with pain. He collapsed to the ground, the knife slipping from his grasp. I lay there, trembling, barely able to breathe. It was a moment before I could process what had happened. My vision was fading, but through the haze I saw the motel owner, his face a mask of concern, as he sprinted toward me, gun still in hand. "Are you okay?" he asked urgently. His eyes flickered between me and the man who was now lying lifeless on the ground. I think so," I whispered, my voice barely there. The owner looked down at the man, relief flooding his face. "By God, this guy almost killed you." He extended his hand, helping me to my feet. "You'll need first aid for that wound," he said, guiding me inside, away from the carnage. The police arrived minutes later, confirming that the man had been killed. An ambulance rushed me to the hospital where doctors treated my wound. Fortunately, the knife hadn't struck anything vital, and after some stitches and antibiotics, I was okay. But the truth hit me later. That man hadn't just attacked me randomly. He had murdered his girlfriend in the room I had seen him leave. He had come after me because he thought I had witnessed it all and would go to the police. That night, I was convinced I wasn't going to make it out alive. But in the end, I was saved. And I'll never forget the feeling of that bullet, the one that stopped a killer in his tracks, just in time to save my life.